Welcome. Today we're talking about religion, and we often hear about various tensions between religion and secularism, religion and reason, science, etc. I thought it'd be interesting to explore the question from this point of view, are some religions more problematic than others in terms of their the influence of religion on how people actually live their lives. Now, if we take a broad historical view, I think we see that a lot of religions have caused problems throughout the centuries, in many cases have blood on their hands. If we look at more recent history, we often see that violent fanaticism tends to be concentrated a lot in the Islamic world. I think this is something we should be curious about and why this is the case, that today we see a lot of extremism, a lot of fanaticism concentrated in that part of the world. One explanation that occasionally comes up, I've heard this even from some objectivist intellectuals, is, well, the West, that is the Judeo-Christian West, had a Renaissance which introduced some secularism and was a transitional period towards greater reason and science and eventually political and economic progress. And the reasoning goes that the Islamic world never had anything quite like that. I think the actual case is even stranger because, to give a little bit of the background, so the rise of Christianity corresponded with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the invasion of various Germanic tribes from the north and the northeast, and the eventual onset of this period of the Dark and Middle Ages. And then, of course, the Renaissance was a kind of a transitional period out of that, leading towards a rise of reason and science and political freedom. The curious thing about the Islamic world is that after the rise of Islam in about about the seventh century, there was this period lasting at least from about the 8th century to the 13th century, which has sometimes been called the Golden Age of Islam. And it was a period of incredible scientific, philosophical, architectural, artistic, medical accomplishment. There were great thinkers and scholars like Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, who made incredible contributions to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, countless fields. There was an incredible flourishing of art and architecture, and for some reason it didn't last. And I'd like to explore some of the reasons for the rise of this Islamic empire and this golden age. And so we'd like to explore some of the theories of why it ended and why it didn't give rise to a glorious rebirth along the lines of what we see in the Western world. So here to help me take this apart is our historian in residence, James Valliant. James, how are you doing?
I'm great. I'm great. And you seem to be great too, but how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. So the first topic I want to discuss is the rise of Islam. So Islam originated around the beginning of the 7th century, and very quickly it conquered huge areas of territory, not just in the Middle East, Arabia, and Persia, but also large sections of the north coast of Africa, ultimately leading all the way to the Spanish Peninsula, Asia Minor, what is modern day Pakistan. What is it that made Islam so successful in its early centuries, that it was able to occupy such enormous territories?
Well, I think that's a complex question, but I think that you can contrast what Christianity was doing to the Roman Empire with what Islam did for the Arab people. One was the collapse of the existing civilization, as you pointed out. Greco-Roman civilization was under tremendous assault from Neoplatonic mysticism, and some form, I think, of Neoplatonic monotheism was going to take over the Roman Empire. Christianity happened to be that form that took over the Roman Empire, and you can see things happening that caused the collapse of that civilization from within Christianity itself. The young sons of aristocrats weren't joining the army; they were joining monasteries. And so more and more the Roman world had to rely on foreign armies, their allies, German allies, for example, to defend the empire And those German allies became Romanized over time and took over the Roman Empire in the West. And that's, in effect, the collapse of the West was sort of religiously caused. Islam has a lot of the same elements of Christianity in one sense. Both are predicated on a kind of syncretism that fuses local religious ideas with Greek philosophy. No question that both do both. In Islam's case, however, the shackles of using violence were taken off. And so they could take off like a shot. The Byzantine Empire, their major threat, was the Eastern Roman Empire. It was in a state of slow, as opposed to the West, which collapsed rapidly. The Eastern Christian Roman Empire slowly was just being falling apart, if you will, dissolving. If the West fell by collapse and invasion by barbarians, the East fell by a self-inflicted lobotomy. In the 8th century, 9th centuries, there's the iconoclasm of the Byzantine Empire. They were deeply mystical, and they were going into a deep, deep kind of mysticism, and they were in collapse as well. So Islam took advantage of the collapsing of the Roman Empire, including the Eastern Roman Empire. They were ideologically unshackled by thinking that conquest was a sin or something, violence was a sin or something. So they took off like a shot. You're absolutely right. And they spread from the Atlantic, in effect, on one side of the old world to basically the Pacific, to Southeast Asia and Indonesia. Today, the largest population of Muslims is all the way out in Indonesia, which is sort of breathtaking if you think about the scope. They took off like a shot. And they had, while there were political divisions, at first they had it was an empire, in effect, with, distinct political divisions within it, but a very much culturally unified empire. And when they took over, they were hungry as heck for classical learning. And part of the rise of the Golden Age is exactly that. You've got thinkers like Averroes, who is really Aristotelian. And you've got, as you point out, extraordinary, between the 9th and the 13th centuries, you've got revolution in medicine, the introduction from India of a new number system. We call it the Arabic number system that has the zero in it, for example.
Came
That
from
was
India, right?
right. That was rejecting the Roman numeral system. They adopted the Arab numeral system in the West, interestingly. Medicine, architecture, mathematics, and they were key transmission belts for ancient Greek ideas, the ideas of Plato and Aristotle.
Which
I
they
was,
translated they translated from Greek into Arabic.
they did.
And eventually the spread of Aristotle's ideas in the West actually came through Islamic sources.
Indeed, they preserved some of the ancient classics when the West had lost interest in Aristotle. In effect, the Muslim world was increasing their interest. At least for that golden age, there was at least a voice of Aristotelianism there, and Averroes is the outstanding example. They were characterized, interestingly, in the Golden Age by a kind of religious tolerance as well. So a Jewish thinker like Moses Maimonides could be the physician to the Caliph of Cairo or the Caliph of Cordoba, and he could engage in Spain. As you point out, the Muslims actually came into Europe, conquered the Iberian Peninsula, crossed the Pyrenees into France. It was Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles Martel, who had to beat him back, Charles the Hammer, beat him back into Spain. And then over a period of centuries, the Reconquista occurred, where Christians were taking back slowly until 1492, in effect, when the last bit of Muslim Spain was conquered. But they also came after the Byzantine Empire fell. They also came from the other side in Europe. And it was the Habsburgs in Austria who had to beat them down in the Balkans and push them out.
Yeah, and just to clarify this, so the fall of the Byzantine Empire, that was the sack of Constantinople, right? 1453 was officially
Yeah,
the
they were already in deep, deep trouble by the time it was that one little city. Now think of it, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to this city. So yeah, in the 1450s, they finally get sacked for the last time. But remember, shortly after 1200, the Venetians, Christian Italians had sacked Constantinople 200 years earlier. And the empire, the Eastern Byzantine Empire was in a state of, in fact, that's what set off the Crusades, right, in the 11th century, was when the Muslims took over from the Byzantines the Holy Land. And the Western Christian world was afraid that the pilgrim routes would be interfered with. That's why the Pope in 1099 called for the Crusades, right? The Muslims are taking over the Byzantine world, taking over Christendom, which is
Yeah.
in the East in collapse.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to do is give people a picture of what life was actually like in the Islam during the Islamic Golden Age. And something that's underappreciated is that people actually had freedom of religion and freedom of their own languages. Like so, Arabic was
To a great extent.
understandably the administrative language, but people did, like you mentioned, well, Moses Maimonides. There was freedom of religion, and people could speak their own languages. So there were actual
Jewish
all
thinkers,
sorts of
Persian
benefits.
thinkers, Greek thinkers were all active in this time. You're absolutely correct. There's a kind of fusion of cultures going on, a kind of syncretism that's going on, a fusion of things going on right at this moment. And it was relatively tolerant. As I say, a Jew could be the physician to caliphs, rulers of the Islamic world at this time. It was a period, and you know, in history, objectivist historian once told me that the three most important words in history are compared to what, and of course that is true. Compared to the world around it, in the Golden Age, the Islamic world was tolerant, and so it does. You know, within the Muslim world, there was an argument. Obviously, Aristotle is a challenge to religion, as such, and so when you've got people introducing Aristotle, Al-Razi, Averroes, introducing this pagan pro-reason attitude, there's going to be within Islamic thought pushback. How far do we push this back? And so there were mystics, hardcore mystics, who were pushing back on the Aristotelian revolution, which has to be considered foundational to all of this. The achievements in science are fundamentally Aristotelian. And this is true whether it's the ancient world, the Islamic world, or the Christian world. It is Aristotle who's the father of observation, logic, what we call science. And so this world of tolerance and pro-reason scientific achievement is hinging on the influence, the extent of the influence of Aristotle, I would argue. And I would argue that the same is true when we consider the Christian world, when we go compare the two.
Yeah, and now if we consider some of the theories as to why the Islamic Golden Age didn't last, why it eventually collapsed. So one figure who is often, at least in the West, been pictured as kind of the villain of the story is Al-Ghazali, who was an 11th century polymath, theologian. Now there's a famous clip of Neil deGrasse Tyson claiming that Al-Ghazali hated mathematics and hated science, which, I mean, that's been endlessly debunked. Al-Ghazali, in fact, was quite interested in mathematics and astronomy, and many of his successors did important work in those fields. Now, he did write a famous book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, where he's not so much attacking philosophy as such, but he's attacking certain Aristotelian interpretations which clash with scripture, which clash what's actually written in the Quran. Specifically, he's taking issue with the school of Ibn Sina or Avicenna, and so can we talk a little bit about that? So is he a villain or is he a maligned character? And how did he influence the thinking that came after him?
The fact that someone is educated and even contributing to science doesn't mean at the end of the day they're not philosophical villains. Immanuel Kant comes to mind. Immanuel Kant had some interesting scientific observations. That's not the key to Immanuel Kant. As objectivists, no. I would say the same is true of Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was part of the Golden Age. He was an educated guy. He had to be to have that kind of respect in that intellectual atmosphere. He had to be. But on the other hand, he gave a very powerful critique of the Aristotelianism that was rising in his time. And he gave a more powerful critique, I would argue, to Aristotle. Now, there was a similar controversy going on in medieval Christian Europe about Aristotle, an intense one, but he gave a more powerful critique of Aristotelianism as such from an Islamic perspective than really anything we're going to see although Aristotle was banned. Aristotle's works were condemned. Aristotle, there was a giant argument between the mystics and the Aristotelians and the semi-Aristotelians. So you're going to have an argument in medieval Europe among Christians, which is, again, the mystics versus the Aristotelians. But the mystics don't have an Al-Ghazali in the Christian world. That's one of the differences. There is, although there are mystics attacking the new learning from the Greeks and Aristotle, there's no one with the power and the eloquence of Al-Ghazali against Aristotle. That is to say, Al-Ghazali is more philosophical, more rational, more systematic in his attack on Aristotle than anything you get from the Christian mystics in the Middle Ages, I would submit. In fact, one of the real differences is the Christian medieval world late to the scene on Aristotle. Aristotle and the Greeks begin to be introduced in the 10th century among Christians. And by the 13th century, there's a huge controversy. Aquinas is central to this controversy, he and his teacher Albertus Magnus, but they were opposed. There were Christians in the 1200s who repeatedly outright condemned the use of Aristotle, and there was an intense debate in the 1200s, 1300s. It's finally resolved in the 1400s in Aristotle's favor. Part of it is the medieval scholastics among Christians had a much richer and thicker Aristotelian movement. There were many more figures who were influenced by Aristotle's logic, for example. And so there's an in-between state among these Christian medievals. It's not just the stark choice of Aquinas versus Meister Eckhart, the intense mystic, let's say. There are men like William of Ockham. We're saying, well, we don't have to go as far as Thomas Aquinas, but we still want to use Aristotelian logic. We don't have to go full Aristotle. See, he's the father of nominalism, but he's still using Aristotle. So the in-between state is much more tolerant of Aristotle, or at least portions of Aristotle. You could criticize Aristotle and still use Aristotle within the Christian medieval framework. So I would say that the Christian Aristotelian movement of the Middle Ages was a much bigger in its impact, because there were just a lot more thinkers who were Aristotelian, and they were much more methodologically focused. That is to say that the Christian scholastics were intensely interested in what philosophers call epistemology. Not to say Averroes was not to say that these methodological issues were critical to Al-Ghazali. It is simply to say that there is a much greater focus on methodology among the Aristotelians in the Christian world than there was in the Islamic world. Another reason that I think is important to bear in mind is the relative political independence. And this is a geographical thing, frankly, of Europe. The thing that made Europe hard for the Muslims to conquer is exactly what made it hard for Europeans to get together. So what's going on in Europe in the 1200s? An intense conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. And so in northern Italy, just within northern Italy, some cities took the Pope's side, some cities took the Emperor's side. If you're a thinker, if you're one of these monks, all you have to do is go to another city for political protection, so that what might be considered heresy in one place is perfectly tolerated in another. This relative political independence in Europe actually was a breather. It gave, let me put it this way, it gave Aristotelian heretics who are questioning the religion that they inherit a breathing space. So I would say that
which they did not have in the Islamic world. Is that what you're saying?
I think that it's much easier in the Islamic world for the political authority, because look at the big political units that were involved, and those centralized authorities, whether it's the caliphs at the earlier period when the Turks come, the Sultan, these centralized authorities could lay down the law, shut out heresy, with extreme prejudice, mind you, like in the good old days. Now, Christians, mind you, were no better than the Muslims when it came to fight. I mean, within the Christian world, obviously, just 300-400 years ago, if you were one kind of Christian versus another kind of Christian, that could get you tortured and burnt at the stake. for just a slight sectarian difference among Christians. That kind of ruthless intolerance characterized the world until just the last few centuries. But the political unity of the Islamic world made it practically impossible for free thinking to occur. And so I
Yeah.
think that it's a complex answer, but one is the Christian world developed methodologically an Aristotelian movement unlike anything seen up to that point. Even in the ancient world, mind you, I think that medieval Christians were the first to really develop a strong, diverse school of Aristotelian epistemologists for the first time. And so by the time you get to the 14 and 1500s, in the Christian world, Aristotle is winning at the very time when the hardcore mystics are winning in the Islamic world. So in the 14 and 1500s, you really are seeing the decline of culture in the Islamic world. And that's exactly when the Renaissance is kicking into gear in the Christian world. And the
And that's what
Renaissance,
historians sometimes call the Great Divergence, right? The rise of the West and the decline of the East. I would like to take a moment to explore some of the other theories that have been offered for the decline of the Islamic Golden Age. But first of all, let's just take a moment to check in with our producer, Daniel, and any super chats from our audience.
We have a few super chats. So we have a super chat from James. Thank you so much. Who says, non-Jew here from the US. Keep up the great work, guys. This channel has been hugely informative for me in seeing things clearly. So thank you so much. Thank you also, Bonnie, for a super chat. And thank you, Jonathan, for the super chat just came in. And thank you, PC, for your super chat. He says Islam was always violent.
that is a question I wanted to bring up as well. Christianity, if you can summarize the ethics of Christianity, it's submit, submit, submit. To turn the other cheek to aggressive violence, right? You can't run away, you can't block the punch, you certainly can't hit back. If someone hits you, you've got to say, okay, hit me over here too. So Christianity is, love your enemies, submit to the evildoer, blessed are the peacemakers, turn the other cheek, submit, submit, submit. Islam is not like that. Islam, if you could summarize it, it's kill, kill, kill in the face of opposition. And that's part of why Islam took off like a shot. I think that's far more explanatory of the initial difference between Islam and Christianity. But as time wears on, it's going to affect the political attitudes, let me put it this way, of Christian Europe in a way that Islam is totally unaffected. So I think the point you raise is an important one. Islam in itself, if you read the Quran, you read the important hadith, you realize that there's a lot more overt pro-violence, pro-religious violence talk than there is in the Christian literature. I would go even deeper than that, though. I would say that Christianity is, by its nature, also more rooted in Greek thought. Greco-Roman thought is much more important in the details of early Christian literature. Now, I'm not going to deny that Greek thought wasn't important. Plato played an important role. Greek thought played a vital and important role in the development of Islam and the Quran, but it was also influenced by other things, other Eastern religious traditions, Persian and Jewish and mystical non-Greek traditions had a bigger role in developing the Quran. Although Christianity enshrined the worst ideas of the ancient Greeks, Platonism, the Stoic Logos, Cynic asceticism. It's enshrining the worst of Greek ideas, but it's enshrining Greek ideas so that when the new Greek learning gets revived in the Middle Ages, there's a deeper connection, I think, that Christianity has to Greek thought that Christians could readily see as opposed to Islam. So I think there's a couple of factors about the content of Islam being different from Christianity that are relevant here, certainly.
Yeah, can we just take a look at some of the alternate theories for why the Islamic Golden Age didn't last? So some people have proposed that the reasons were political and or economic. So for example, that the caliphs were they were living in luxury too much, they were too decadent, and people eventually revolted against them. There's the whole idea of the siege of Baghdad in 1258, where the Mongols invaded and killed tens of thousands of Muslims. And of course, you mentioned earlier the expulsion of the Muslims from Spain in 1492. How important do you think these considerations are in explaining the decline of this golden age, the political and economic arguments?
I think those are much more effects than the fundamental causes. There are much more effects than fundamental causes, politics and economics. I mean, Lord knows that the kings of Christian Europe, and indeed the Catholic Church of Western Europe, lived in the lap of luxury themselves, for example, when they could. It's not really a question of motive here because both sides would happily have taken over the game. It's a question of actually the power of the ideas and the effect of the ideas. By the time, see, in the siege of Baghdad in the 1200s, that was a major, major challenge to the existing world of the caliphs in the Golden Age, no question. But was Christianity undergoing defeats like that? How about the collapse of the Byzantine Christian Empire that I'm talking about? In time, the entire Byzantine world, in effect, is going to be taken over by Muslim Ottoman Turks. They themselves, in Russia, of course, the Mongols got that far and challenged Christians. Partly, I would say, there's the geography of Europe that prevented the Mongols from going so far, but that's really not even the essential answer because Christians were suffering huge defeats of the same kind as the siege of Baghdad in the 1200s. More than that, in the 12 and 1300s, the Muslim world went through a wave of bubonic plague, just as Europe would go through a wave of bubonic plague in the 1300s, killing a third to a half of the population in the 14th century. So the Christian world and the Muslim world suffered similar setbacks at around this time. The question is not going to be answered in a military or economic way. It's going to have to be answered in a deeper cultural way. I will submit that the reason for the Renaissance in the 14 and 1500s was the greater hold that Aristotelianism had taken on the Christian mind by that point in a way that it never seized hold in the Islamic mind. Aristotelianism was never really secure as a cultural phenomenon in the Islamic world in a way that Aristotelianism gained a foothold and security in the Christian West. And that made all the difference in the world. By the end of the 1500s, Thomas Aquinas is a doctor of the church. And Aristotle, we can say, has officially won.
And can you offer any final thoughts on what we today can learn from the fall of the Islamic Golden Age? What's the lesson to take away here?
Glory can be fleeting if you do not pay attention to ideas. It is ideas that govern history. It is ideas that are by far the most important causal factor in human history, just as they're not the sole causal factor in your life or mine as individuals, but ideas are the most important causal factor in your life as an individual and in our culture as a whole as a result. And so I would say it stresses the importance of philosophy. These subtle philosophical differences, the hold, for example, with which Aristotle seized a culture, made the difference, ladies and gentlemen. It really, really did. And philosophy matters. Philosophy is really the most important factor if you're considering our world today, the challenges that our civilization is facing from Islam. We're facing a real neo-mysticism over there, and our weak response is conditioned by our philosophy. The holdovers from Christianity, I think, are making us unable to respond to the threat of Islam against civilization in a clear way. Here, the enemy is Christian ethics and thought. We have to understand that at this point, it's Islam versus secular, rational, scientific civilization as such. As such. That's my big takeaway.
Well said. I'll give the final word to our producer, Daniel. Daniel, do we have any final words from our viewers?
We have a super chat from Mark, and it actually brings me to the question I would ask anyway. Thank you, Dr. Valliant and Nick. Ways to connect. And I just say all links can be found in the chat in the description, sorry. But if there's anything either James or Nicholas would like to mention, you can now.
Oh,
Yeah, we'll just go with the links in the description. So thank you to all of our viewers for supporting the show. Thank you, James, for your many historical insights. As always, I look forward to chatting with you again soon. And please remember to stick around for the reality show, which is coming up in a minute or two. Thanks very much, everyone.
take care.